Los Angeles, under the chaotic hum of the city, a dark secret lurked. The Muffin Man, once a quiet and kind soul known for his delectable blueberry muffins, had turned into a monster. His soft, innocent exterior masked a mind that reveled in murder. He didn't kill for any reason other than his own enjoyment. He killed because he loved the fear it spread, the bewilderment in the eyes of the authorities, and the tears of families as they grieved. And when he left his calling card, a simple blueberry muffin, the world would shudder in confusion. Johnny McNabb, a grizzled old-school detective, had been chasing the Muffin Man for 15 years. A tall, bald-headed, hard-nosed man, McNabb was the kind of detective who never gave up, even when the case seemed hopeless. His partner had been the Muffin Man's 8th victim, and McNabb's obsession with the case was fueled by both grief and a desire for justice. He knew the Muffin Man was right under his nose, but every time he got close, something would go wrong. A witness would vanish, a suspect would disappear, and another victim would turn up. Each death a cruel reminder that the killer was always one step ahead. The Muffin Man had disappeared for 5 years, taking a hiatus that drove McNabb to the edge of madness. The silence was worse than the killings, leaving McNabb in a state of constant unease, unable to move forward, wondering if the killer had left Los Angeles forever. But deep down, McNabb knew he was still out there, waiting. And when the killings resumed, they were more brutal than ever, a twisted game for the Muffin Man to watch unfold. The Muffin Man's life was a carefully constructed facade. To the outside world, he was the friendly neighbor, the man who baked muffins and pastries every weekend to share with the community. But beneath his bakery was an underground lair, disguised as a bakery but functioning as a torture chamber and slaughterhouse. He baked his goods there, using them as a cover for the grisly acts he performed. It was a place where his darkest desires were allowed to flourish, and it was where he kept his most horrific trophies. And then there was her, his girlfriend. She had no idea. She loved him, trusted him, and believed he was the kind man who baked muffins for the neighborhood. But the truth was darker than she could ever imagine. The Muffin Man had killed her mother in cold blood, making it look like an accident so she could collect the life insurance money. He took that money, using it to fund his underground operations. He manipulated her, keeping her under his spell, and she never suspected a thing. The lies he told her were so convincing, she never questioned him. She was trapped in his web, unaware that the man she loved was a monster. McNabb, however, knew the truth. He had been working tirelessly, piecing together in the heart of Los Angeles, under the chaotic hum of the city, a dark secret lurked. The Muffin Man, once a quiet and kind soul known for his delectable blueberry muffins, had turned into a monster. His soft, innocent exterior masked a mind that reveled in murder. He didn't kill for any reason other than his own enjoyment. He killed because he loved the fear it spread, the bewilderment in the eyes of the authorities, and the tears of families as they grieved. And when he left his calling card, a simple blueberry muffin, the world would shudder in confusion. Johnny McNabb, a grizzled old-school detective, had been chasing the Muffin Man for 15 years. A tall, bald-headed, hard-nosed man, McNabb was the kind of detective who never gave up, even when the case seemed hopeless. His partner had been the Muffin Man's 8th victim, and McNabb's obsession with the case was fueled by both grief and a desire for justice. He knew the Muffin Man was right under his nose, but every time he got close, something would go wrong. A witness would vanish, a suspect would disappear, and another victim would turn up. Each death a cruel reminder that the killer was always one step ahead. The Muffin Man had disappeared for 5 years, taking a hike in the heart of Los Angeles, under the chaotic. The scene was eerily quiet when Johnny McNabb arrived. Griffith Park was taped off, the flashing lights of squad cars casting shadows across the trees. McNabb, younger then but already seasoned, stepped out of his unmarked car, a cigarette dangling between his lips. He took one look at the crime scene and felt a knot tighten in his stomach. Karen Wilkes lay sprawled on the jogging path, her lifeless body surrounded by evidence markers. The wounds were precise, deliberate, not the work of someone who had acted in a fit of rage. But what drew McNabb's attention most was the blueberry muffin sitting neatly beside her. McNabb, a younger officer called, walking over with a clipboard. This one's strange. No ID on the perp, no witnesses. And then there's that. The officer gestured to the muffin, its glossy surface catching the dim light. McNabb crouched down, studying the baked good like it held all the answers. "What kind of sick bastard leaves a goddamn muffin at a murder scene?" he muttered, taking a long drag of his cigarette. The crime lab was still working the scene, but McNabb already knew what he was dealing with. "This isn't random," he said almost to himself. "This guy planned this. He's careful, methodical, and that muffin? That's not a mistake. That's a message." He stood, his broad shoulders tense as he stared into the darkness beyond the tape. This isn't the work of some junkie or a street thug. This is a madman. McNabb didn't know it yet, but this was the start of a long, bitter war, a war that would define his career and consume his life. As the scene was processed and officers began packing up, McNabb lingered, staring at the muffin one last time. It was a clue, sure, but it was also a challenge. And deep down, McNabb knew. The Muffin Man wasn't done. Not by a long shot. It was just 3 weeks after Karen Wilkes' murder when the Muffin Man struck again. This time, it was a young man named Eric Stanton, a 22-year-old college student, walking home late after his shift at a local diner. The streets of Los Angeles were quiet that night, the city seemingly holding its breath, unaware that darkness was once again lurking in its shadows. Eric had his headphones in, oblivious to the figure trailing him from a safe distance. The Muffin Man had been watching him for days, studying his routine with the same detached precision he'd used before. For him, it was all part of the game, the planning, the stalking, the waiting. He thrived on it, knowing his prey had no idea they were being hunted. When the moment came, it was quick and silent. The Muffin Man attacked with calculated precision in a dimly lit alley just blocks from Eric's apartment. There was no struggle. The killer made sure of that. And just like before, he left his signature, this time placing a muffin delicately on Eric's chest as if it were a trophy. When the body was discovered hours later, the scene sent shockwaves through the precinct. Johnny McNabb arrived, the memory of Karen Wilkes' murder still fresh in his mind. As he lit another cigarette and stared at Eric's lifeless body, his eyes narrowed at the muffin resting atop him. "Same guy," McNabb said to the officer on the scene. "No doubt about it." He crouched down, studying the placement of the muffin and the precision of the wounds. "This son of a bitch is getting cocky. He's trying to send a message. He's taunting us." The media frenzy that followed the second killing was relentless. The Muffin Man was no longer just an eerie name whispered among detectives. He was a full-blown headline, a specter haunting the streets of LA. But McNabb wasn't interested in headlines. He was focused on one thing: stopping this madman before he could strike again. Back at the station, McNabb pored over every detail of the case, analyzing the patterns, the precision, the choice of victims. He couldn't shake the feeling that the killer was always one step ahead, watching, waiting. The Muffin Man had made his move, and McNabb knew it wouldn't be his last. The room was packed with reporters, cameras flashing as Johnny McNabb stepped up to the podium. His shoulders were tense, his jaw tight. He hated these press conferences, the spectacle, the questions, the pressure to reassure a terrified city when he didn't have all the answers. But he had no choice. The Muffin Man had the whole city on edge, and they wanted to hear from the man leading the case. McNabb cleared his throat, his voice gravely and low. "Good evening. As many of you know, the individual known as the Muffin Man has struck again, taking yet another innocent life. This marks the second confirmed murder tied to this suspect. And let me be clear, this is a dangerous and calculated killer. He's not acting on impulse. He's planning every move, every detail." He glanced down at the podium for a moment, steadying himself, then looked back at the sea of reporters. "I know you all want answers. So do we. But this killer is clever. He's meticulous. He's playing a game, and he's staying one step ahead. But let me make one thing perfectly clear. He will slip. They always do. And when he does, we'll be there." The room erupted in questions, microphones being shoved forward. McNabb held up a hand, silencing the chaos. To the people of Los Angeles, stay vigilant. Watch out for each other. If you see something, report it. And to the man out there listening to this, to the one who thinks he's untouchable, your time is running out. We're coming for you. With that, McNabb stepped away from the podium, ignoring the barrage of shouted questions. He was done talking. Now it was time to act. McNabb marched out of the precinct, the cold night air hitting his face as he lit a cigarette with trembling hands. His mind replayed the call over and over. The Muffin Man was out there, watching, playing his sick game, knowing exactly how to push McNabb to the edge. But what got to him most wasn't the threats or the taunts. It was the truth behind them. The killer was still one step ahead. He got into his car and sat for a moment, gripping the steering wheel as the city buzzed around him. Somewhere out there, the Muffin Man was already planning his next move. McNabb had seen enough of his handiwork to know he wasn't bluffing. Another victim, another gruesome scene. The thought of it made his blood boil. Pulling away from the curb, McNabb headed for the crime lab. He needed answers, and he needed them now. Every detail mattered, no matter how small. The latest forensic reports, any possible connections to past victims, there had to be something he could use to track this bastard down. When he arrived, the lead tech, a wiry young guy named Sandoval, was still working late. He looked up as McNabb entered, a mix of surprise and exhaustion on his face. "Detective, you're still at it?" Sandoval asked. "I need everything you've got on the last scene," McNabb said, his voice sharp. "Anything new?" Sandoval hesitated, then handed McNabb a folder. "We pulled partial prints off the muffin left at the scene, but they don't match anything in the system. And we found traces of an unusual flour blend, some kind of specialty mix imported. Could narrow down the supplier, maybe." McNabb flipped through the folder, his mind racing. Imported flour? It was a stretch, but it was something. He slammed the folder shut and looked at Sandoval. "Run that supplier list. I want every bakery, every grocery store, every damn restaurant in the city that uses it. Start now." Sandoval nodded, already typing away. McNabb leaned against the counter, cigarette dangling from his lips. McNabb marched out of the precinct, the cold night air hitting his face as he lit a cigarette with trembling hands. His mind replayed the call over and over. The Muffin Man was out there, watching, playing his sick game. The Muffin Man's wife, Claire, had always been the picture of innocence. She was soft-spoken, a quiet woman who worked as a school teacher, teaching second grade at a local elementary school. She was the kind of person who smiled at strangers and volunteered at community events. Her friends loved her, and her students adored her. She had a natural gift for nurturing young minds. When she met the Muffin Man, whose real name was Peter, she was instantly charmed by his warmth and his down-to-earth nature. He wasn't like the other men she'd dated in the past. There was something about him that made her feel safe. He was kind, thoughtful, always going out of his way to make her feel special. His weekly tradition of baking muffins and passing them out to neighbors seemed like the perfect expression of his genuine care for others. They married within a year, and to everyone who knew them, they seemed like the perfect couple. Claire adored Peter, and he made sure she felt loved and cherished. He was always there when she needed him, always attentive and affectionate. Even though he kept a low profile, she never questioned him. There was no reason to. But the cracks in their seemingly perfect life started to show shortly after they moved into their new home, a quiet, suburban neighborhood that seemed worlds away from the chaos of Los Angeles. Claire began to notice strange things. Peter would disappear for hours at a time, always coming home with the scent of flour and an odd, unsettling aura about him. When she asked him about it, he would smile his charming smile and say he was just getting some work done. He had always been a private man, so she let it go, convincing herself it was nothing more than his quirky habits. Still, there were nights when she would hear strange noises from the basement. clinking sounds, the scraping of metal against stone, and feel a deep, gnawing unease she couldn't shake. But when she asked him about it, he would just brush it off, saying it was nothing to worry about. "Just some old equipment I'm fixing," he'd say with a wink, his deep, calming voice making her feel like everything was fine. What Claire didn't know was that Peter had a darker side, a side that was buried deep beneath his carefully crafted exterior. He had already started his twisted killing spree by the time they married, and she was blissfully unaware of the evil lurking behind his charming smile. But one night, after a particularly harrowing phone call with the police, she started to piece together the truth. Her suspicions grew when she found a file hidden in his desk, photos of the victims, gruesome and unsettling. Her heart sank as she realized the horrible truth. The man she had married was the very monster the police had been chasing for years. The Muffin Man. Claire's world shattered in that moment. The man she loved, the man she had built a life with, was a serial killer. Her stomach twisted, her mind racing with the terrifying implications. She wanted to leave, to run as far away from him as possible, but she felt paralyzed by fear. Peter's charm and control over her had made her a prisoner in their home, and she was too afraid of what might happen if she ever tried to break free. And the worst part, she felt responsible. She knew she had turned a blind eye to the signs, convinced herself that it was all just coincidence, but now the weight of that guilt was crushing her. As much as she hated herself for not seeing it sooner, she also couldn't help but love him. He was still her husband, the man who once held her in his arms and whispered promises of forever. But deep down, Claire knew that the man she had married no longer existed. The Muffin Man had taken his place, and she was trapped in a nightmare she could no longer escape. Claire's silence became a heavy burden she carried with each passing day. Every smile she flashed at her neighbors, every kind word she offered, felt like an act, an ever-deepening lie. She went through the motions of a normal life, but in the quiet moments when she was alone, the gnawing anxiety became unbearable. She could still see the horrific images in her mind, hear the sinister sound of Peter's voice echoing in her ears. It was like living with a ghost, a constant reminder of the truth she had to suppress. The weight of it all started to seep into every part of her life. She stopped visiting friends, withdrew from her family, and started to avoid public spaces. She couldn't shake the feeling that someone would eventually discover what she knew, that the walls were closing in around her. It was as if the world was starting to notice the cracks in her calm facade. But Peter never showed signs of worry. To him, it was business as usual. He continued to bake muffins, to visit the neighbors, to play the role of the perfect husband. His dark side never left him, but it seemed to exist in a world separate from the one Claire inhabited. He kept up his charm, his smile, his comforting presence, as if nothing had changed. And for the most part, Claire let it. She still loved him, despite the darkness, despite the monster he had become. One night, after she had put everything away, cleaning the kitchen and watching TV in a numb, automatic haze, Claire found herself sitting at the table, the silence pressing down on her. She didn't hear Peter moving around the house, and a wave of unease crept over her. Had he gone out? Was he planning something? A faint sound from downstairs broke the silence, the scrape of a chair. Claire's heart raced. She knew he had some kind of ritual, some private time in the basement, but tonight it felt different. Something was wrong. Slowly, she made her way down the stairs. As she neared the basement door, she hesitated. The sight of the door always unsettled her. Too many memories, too many unknowns. With a deep breath, Claire pushed it open. The basement was dark, except for a single light hanging over the workbench. Peter stood there, his back to her, seemingly lost in his work. She stepped into the room, her voice barely a whisper. "Peter?" He turned, a smile slowly curling on his lips. His eyes were cold, distant, more so than she had ever seen them before. "I've been thinking, Claire," he said, his voice low, "about how you've been acting lately, about how distant you've become." Claire's throat tightened. Her heart thudded painfully in her chest, and the air felt thick with tension. She took a step back, instinctively wanting to distance herself from the coldness of his gaze. "I'm just tired," she said, forcing her voice to sound normal, even though her hands were shaking. "Just a lot on my mind." Peter didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stepped toward her, his movements slow, deliberate. "Are you sure that's all? Because I've noticed things, Claire, little things." He tilted his head, his gaze never leaving hers. "You've been avoiding me." Fear surged in her chest, but she masked it as best as she could, pretending everything was fine. "I'm not avoiding you. I'm just worried about everything happening." Peter's smile widened, but it was no longer comforting. It was predatory. "I see," he murmured. "Worried about what?" He stepped closer, and Claire could feel the darkness in the room pressing against her. "Worried about me? About us?" Claire swallowed hard. She was trapped by her own secrets, by her love for him, by the terrifying knowledge that Peter was no longer the man she had married. As she stood there, the weight of the moment settling over her like a cold, suffocating blanket, she realized just how far she was from the life she had once known. The man she loved was gone. And the Muffin Man, the monster that had taken his place, was now all that remained. The Muffin Man had already decided who his next victim would be. It was a young woman named Lily, someone who worked at a small cafe on the outskirts of town. She was the kind of person who would give you a warm smile without thinking twice, always eager to help, always ready to lend an ear. She had been kind to him the first time he stopped by for one of her pastries, and that, in his mind, was enough to make her worthy of his next lesson in fear. It was a rainy Thursday evening when he finally made his move. Peter had been planning this for weeks, watching her from the shadows, learning her routine. He knew that she worked late shifts, closing up the cafe alone after the last customer had gone. It was perfect. No one would hear her scream, and no one would be around to stop him. He arrived just as the cafe was preparing to close for the night. The familiar scent of fresh-baked bread and coffee lingered in the air, mingling with the sharp scent of rain on the pavement outside. The lights flickered as the last few patrons trickled out, leaving Lily alone behind the counter, wiping down the surfaces. Peter had watched her for long enough. He knew she'd be on edge tonight. There had been rumors floating around about the recent string of disappearances. The fear in her eyes would be just the touch of sweetness he needed to savor before he claimed her life. He waited until the cafe was empty, then slipped inside through the back door. His footsteps were silent as he moved through the shadows, the rain masking any sound of his approach. He could see her in the dim light, humming softly to herself as she stacked cups on the shelf. Lily didn't hear him until it was too late. By the time she turned around, Peter was already standing in front of her, his eyes cold and unblinking. The knife in his hand gleamed in the low light. "Lily," he said, his voice smooth, almost tender, "I've been watching you." Her eyes widened in shock, but before she could react, he moved in quickly, his knife flashing through the air. She barely had time to scream before his blade sliced through her throat, silencing her cries. Peter's smile never faltered as he watched her collapse to the ground, blood pooling around her. There was something almost serene about it. His work was always methodical, precise. It was like creating a masterpiece, each victim a brushstroke on the canvas of his twisted existence. But this time there was something else in the air, something almost comforting. The quiet of the rain outside, the stillness of the night. It felt perfect. As he stood over Lily's lifeless body, the door to the cafe creaked open. He didn't even flinch. No one would be coming in. He had made sure of that. He took a step back, admiring his work, his eyes gleaming with satisfaction. Another life taken, another message sent. Johnny McNabb would know soon enough. But for now, Peter was content, his bloodlust sated for the moment. He took a slow, deliberate breath, savoring the moment. Then, with a final glance at Lily's body, he walked out of the cafe and into the night, the sound of the rain echoing in the distance. Johnny's phone buzzed in his pocket, and he pulled it out without hesitation, already knowing who was calling. The number was unlisted, but he recognized the pattern. The Muffin Man, Peter Cox. The man who had haunted his every waking moment for the past 15 years. He answered the call, his voice cold and steady, but his pulse quickened. "You think you're clever, don't you?" McNabb growled into the phone, stepping outside the cafe to escape the reporters and chaos. On the other end, the muffled sound of laughter echoed through the speaker, dark and twisted. The voice was smooth, almost casual, but there was an unmistakable undercurrent of malice. "Johnny, Johnny, Johnny, you always know just when to pick up," Peter said, his tone dripping with amusement. "I just wanted to thank you, you know, for making this so much fun." McNabb's grip on the phone tightened. "What's your point, Peter? You still don't get it, do you?" Peter's voice was low, mocking. "You're chasing shadows, Johnny. I'm always 2 steps ahead. Always. You think you know who I am, but you'll never catch me. You'll never find me, no matter how hard you try." McNabb's eyes narrowed as he stepped into the rain, his mind racing. "I'm gonna find you. And when I do, I'll blow your fucking face off, you son of a bitch." Peter laughed again, louder this time. "You're funny, Johnny. Always so full of rage, so quick to pull the trigger. But you know what? You're not in control here, not anymore. This is my game now. And the next move, well, that's on me, isn't it?" Johnny's teeth ground together, his fists clenching. "I'm done playing your game, Peter. I'm putting an end to this." "Oh, but you won't," Peter said, his voice almost a whisper now, as if savoring the moment. "You won't stop me, and the next person I choose, well, let's just say they'll be a lot more fun than the last." McNabb could feel the weight of the threat in Peter's words, but he didn't let it show. He had heard this before. The taunts, the promises of death. It was always the same. "You don't scare me, Peter," he shot back. "You're nothing but a cow." Johnny's phone buzzed in his pocket, and he pulled it out without hesitation, already knowing who was calling. Johnny's jaw clenched tighter as the call continued, the sickening calm in Peter's voice cutting through him like a blade. He could almost picture the bastard grinning on the other end, savoring the torment he was inflicting. "You're calm, Peter," McNabb hissed, his voice dripping with barely contained rage. "But I swear to God, I'm going to make you regret every second you've spent hiding. I'm coming for you, and I'm not stopping. You hear me? I'm not stopping." Peter's laughter rang out, unsettling in its icy tranquility. "You're always so angry, Johnny, so sure of yourself, but you've never been in control. I am, and I'm always watching, waiting for the perfect moment. You'll never see me coming." McNabb's grip on the phone tightened until he could feel it creaking, but he didn't back down. "You're a fucking coward, Peter, hiding behind your games, hiding behind your lies. You'll never be the one in control, not while I'm breathing." Another pause. Then, cold as ice, Peter's voice came through once more. "I don't need to be in control, Johnny. I'm already playing the game. And you? You're just the next piece on the board." McNabb stood there, the phone pressed to his ear, every word from Peter only fueling the rage boiling inside him. He could almost feel Peter watching him from the shadows, playing his sick little game like it was all some twisted joke. "I'm done chasing shadows, Peter," McNabb growled, barely able to keep his voice steady. "I'm going to make you pay for every life you've taken, starting with yours." Peter's voice dropped even lower, the mockery now replaced with something far more sinister. "You'll try, Johnny, but you'll never catch me. You're too slow, and when you fail, just like you always do, I'll be waiting." The line went dead, and McNabb's fist slammed into the side of his car with a deafening thud. His knuckles were raw, but the pain was nothing compared to the burning need for revenge that coursed through his veins. The Muffin Man, Peter, had made one final mistake. He had taunted Johnny McNabb one too many times. And now McNabb wasn't just Johnny's jaw clenched tighter as the call continued, the sickening calm in Peter's voice cutting through him like a blade. He could almost picture the bastard grinning on the other end, savoring the torment he was inflicting. "You're calm, Peter," McNabb hissed, his voice dripping with barely contained rage. "But I swear to God." McNabb stood frozen, the echoes of the Muffin Man's laugh lingering in the cold air. His partner's lifeless body was a grotesque reminder of how close he was to the madness. McNabb couldn't breathe. His eyes burned with tears, but he didn't allow them to fall. Not yet. Not until he was alone. He couldn't afford weakness, not when the man who had taken Tanner from him was still out there. His hands shook violently as he dialed the number for backup. He should have been focusing on getting the scene secured, but all he could see was Tanner's face, the face of a man he had trusted, the face of a friend who had never deserved this. The dispatcher's voice crackled through his phone, but McNabb's mind was elsewhere. "You still with me, detective?" the voice asked. McNabb didn't answer right away, too consumed by the image of Tanner's body torn apart. The muffled, lifeless weight of it felt like a weight that would never leave him. He gritted his teeth and spoke, his voice rough, like gravel being scraped across his throat. "Tanner's dead. The Muffin Man, he's fucking real." The dispatcher responded with a flurry of instructions, but McNabb couldn't hear them. His thoughts were a swirling storm of anger and vengeance. He could feel the blood rushing in his ears. He'd been right there, so close, and still the Muffin Man had slipped through his fingers. He dropped the phone and fell to his knees beside Tanner's body. He wanted to scream, to punch a hole in the walls of the warehouse, but all he could do was sit in silence, stewing in his helplessness. Tanner had been a good cop, a good man, someone McNabb would have called family if he'd ever had one. McNabb was about to stand when something caught his eye. Something small, almost insignificant at first. There, in the shadows, a single blueberry muffin lay on the floor, as if it had been casually discarded. The Muffin Man's calling card. A chill ran down McNabb's spine as he stared at the muffin. It was as though the entire room closed in around him. The weight of everything. Tanner's death, the chase, the taunting phone calls, the years of agony pressing in on his chest. He reached out and grabbed the muffin, his fingers trembling. He didn't know what to do with it. McNabb stood frozen, the echoes of the Muffin Man's laugh lingering in the cold air. His partner's lifeless body was a grotesque reminder of how close he was to the madness. McNabb couldn't breathe. His eyes burned with tears, but he didn't allow them to fall. Not yet. Not until he was alone. He couldn't afford weakness, not when the man who had taken Tanner from him was still out there. His hands shook violently as he dialed the number for backup. He should have been focusing on getting the scene secured, but all he could see was Tanner's face, the face of a man he had trusted, the face of a friend who had never deserved this. The dispatcher's voice crackled through his phone, but McNabb's mind was elsewhere. "You still with me, detective?" the voice asked. McNabb didn't answer right away, too consumed by the image of Tanner's body torn apart. The muffled, lifeless weight of it felt like a weight that would never leave him. He gritted his teeth and spoke, his voice rough, like gravel being scraped across his throat. "Tanner's dead. The Muffin Man, he's fucking real." The dispatcher responded with a flurry of instructions, but McNabb couldn't hear them. His thoughts were a swirling storm of anger and vengeance. He could feel the blood rushing in his ears. He'd been right there so close, and still, the Muffin Man had slipped through his fingers. He dropped the phone and fell to his knees beside Tanner's body. He wanted to scream, to punch a hole in the walls of the warehouse, but all he could do was sit in silence, stewing in his helplessness. Tanner had been a good cop, a good man, someone McNabb would have called family if he'd ever had one. McNabb was about to stand when something caught his eye. Something small, almost insignificant at first. There, in the shadows, a single blueberry muffin lay on the floor, as if it had been casually discarded. The Muffin Man's calling card. A chill ran down McNabb's spine as he stared at the muffin. It was as though the entire room closed in around him, the weight of everything. Tanner's death, the chase, the taunting phone calls, the years of agony pressing in on his chest. He reached out and grabbed the muffin, his fingers trembling. He didn't know what to do with it. Was it a message? A game? Or was it a symbol of the Muffin Man's twisted victory over him? In the distance, he heard the sound of sirens, distant but growing louder. The arrival of backup. But McNabb wasn't ready to leave. Not yet. Not until he had something. Some shred of evidence that could lead him to the monster who had taken everything from him. He stood up, holding the muffin tightly in his hand. He was done waiting, done playing by the rules. He had already lost too much. And this time, the Muffin Man wouldn't slip away. This time, Johnny McNabb was going to hunt him down, no matter the cost. Because the Muffin Man had made the worst mistake of his life. He had taken someone McNabb loved. And for that, McNabb would show him what true vengeance looked like. The news spread like wildfire. The Muffin Man was no longer a rumor or a ghost in the shadows. He was a living, breathing nightmare, and his actions had become the focal point of every media outlet in Los Angeles. Every day, his name was plastered across the front pages. Every channel played the latest horrific discovery, each one more gruesome than the last. The terror was palpable. It wasn't just the violence, it was the uncertainty. The fact that the Muffin Man could strike anywhere, at any time, without warning, made the city feel like it was held in an iron grip of fear. The streets of Los Angeles had once been a bustling labyrinth of traffic and noise. Now they were eerily quiet. People didn't venture out unless absolutely necessary. Grocery stores had become ghost towns after dark. Even the bars, which were usually filled with chatter and laughter, had become deserted as people cowered in their homes, afraid to be the next victim. Citizens were terrified to go out. The idea that anyone could be the next target, that the Muffin Man could be hiding in plain sight, was enough to send waves of anxiety through the population. The media fueled the fear, each new report adding to the hysteria. Graphic images of the latest crime scenes were splashed across TV screens, alongside chilling interviews with witnesses and family members of the victims. The Muffin Man's twisted sense of theater had turned the entire city into his stage. He was everywhere. His face was on every screen. His name was on every tongue. He had become the symbol of terror, and Los Angeles was his captive audience. On the streets, the usual bustle of everyday life had turned to whispers. People who walked to work with their heads down, always glancing over their shoulders. It was as if the city had become a living thing, holding its breath, waiting for the next tragedy to strike. People wouldn't even walk their dogs after sunset, fearing they'd become the Muffin Man's next victim. Johnny McNabb could feel it too. The pressure, the frustration. He had tried for years to catch this man, but now it seemed like the Muffin Man had his grip on the entire city. Every time McNabb thought he was close, every lead seemed to slip through his fingers. Every day it felt more like a game of cat and mouse, but the stakes were higher. The Muffin Man wasn't just playing with McNabb anymore. He was toying with an entire city. McNabb sat in his car, watching as another group of news vans parked outside of a crime scene. The headlines were blaring the same damn thing. The Muffin Man strikes again. He slammed his fist into the steering wheel. The media circus, the endless coverage, it was just noise. But it was noise that the Muffin Man thrived on. And McNabb hated that. It only fed into his madness. Every word that came out of the reporters' mouths was just another victory for Peter Cox, the Muffin Man. The citizens of Los Angeles were afraid. And the more they were afraid, the more powerful the Muffin Man became. The city was in a chokehold. And McNabb knew that until he found this man, until he stopped him, that grip would only tighten. The hunt had become personal. But now, it wasn't just about solving the case. It was about saving the city from a monster who was tearing it apart from the inside. McNabb wasn't just chasing Peter Cox anymore. He was chasing the news spread like wildfire. The Muffin Man was no longer a rumor or a ghost. The nosy neighbors across the street had always been a staple of suburban life. They were the type of people who could tell you exactly what time you left for work, how many bags of groceries you bought, and whether or not you took your dog for a walk. Their windows were always slightly ajar, just enough to catch glimpses of the world around them. But lately, they'd become more than just observers. They'd become vigilantes in their own right. Each of them convinced that the Muffin Man was somehow hiding in plain sight, just beyond their front doors. The local gossip was alive and well, but now it was tinged with the dark edge of paranoia. Every time McNabb passed their house, he could feel their eyes on him, watching from behind the curtains like silent sentinels. They knew he was close to something, even if they didn't know what. They speculated, whispered, and exchanged theories about the Muffin Man's next move, like they were all part of the same macabre community event. It wasn't just the police they thought were involved. No, to them, everyone was a suspect. And if they couldn't figure it out, then McNabb was the one who had to. It was late one evening when McNabb was driving home from another dead-end lead. His eyes instinctively darted to the house across the street. There, standing in the front yard under a flickering porch light, was Mrs. Hargrove, the nosiest of the bunch. Her arms were crossed, her brow furrowed with suspicion as she stared at McNabb's car. She'd always been a problem for McNabb. Over the years, she'd dropped so many unsolicited, helpful tips at the station, McNabb had lost count. Every time a neighbor went missing, Mrs. Hargrove was quick to inform the precinct. If she saw someone new in the neighborhood, she was the first to call in a suspicious individual. But now, McNabb wasn't so sure if her instincts were completely off. As McNabb turned onto his block, he slowed down. The nosy neighbors across the street had always been a staple of suburban life. They were the type of people who could tell you exactly what time you left for work, how many bags of groceries you bought, and whether or not you took your... The Muffin Man, ever the manipulator, had been keeping a close eye on Billy for weeks, watching from the shadows as he roamed the streets of Los Angeles, unknowingly walking right into his trap. He had been waiting for the perfect moment, the perfect opportunity to turn Billy into the perfect scapegoat. It came one night after a particularly brutal killing. A young woman had been found in an alley, her body mutilated in a way that only the Muffin Man could do. Her final moments marked by his signature, a freshly baked blueberry muffin placed beside her body. The crime scene was grisly, and the police were already on high alert. Billy, unaware of the danger closing in on him, had been walking near the crime scene when he heard the sirens wailing in the distance. He hadn't seen the body yet, but he knew something terrible had happened. He stood there frozen, staring at the flashing lights when the Muffin Man made his move. Billy had been walking home from a late-night study session at the library, tired and distracted, when the Muffin Man casually approached him. The Muffin Man, now wearing a dark hoodie, walked up behind him, his presence almost unnoticed by the young teenager. He tapped Billy on the shoulder, causing him to turn around in surprise. "Hey, kid," the Muffin Man said, his voice low and cold. "You seen anything suspicious around here?" Billy blinked, a little startled. "No, just walking home from the library. What's going on?" "The usual," the Muffin Man replied cryptically, before tossing a bag at Billy's feet. Billy didn't even have time to react before the Muffin Man was gone, disappearing into the night. Billy looked down at the bag, confused. When he opened it, his heart sank. Inside, the bag contained a set of bloody clothes, bloodied to the point that it was hard to tell if they had been worn recently. The stench of death clung to them, and Billy's stomach churned at the sight. There was also a muffled, almost mocking sound inside the bag. Billy pulled out a small container with a freshly baked blueberry muffin. He froze. His first thought was to run to the police, to explain that he was innocent. But then, a terrible realization dawned on him. He was right next to the crime scene, his fingerprints on the bag, and if anyone found the bloody clothes with the Muffin Man's signature muffin, they would think the worst. Before he could make a decision, sirens blared down the street. Panic set in. He couldn't risk being caught with the evidence, so he did the only thing he thought might help him. He dropped the bag on the ground and ran, hoping the chaos of the scene would swallow up any trace of him. It wasn't long before Billy found himself in handcuffs. The police had found the bag, and with it, the incriminating evidence. The clothes, covered in blood, matched the victim's injuries, and the muffin was unmistakable, the signature of the Muffin Man. McNabb stood in the interrogation room, watching Billy squirm in his chair. Billy was a mess, panicking, trying to explain himself. But McNabb had seen it all before, the lies, the confusion, the desperation. He'd been through this too many times. "Billy Hargrove," McNabb began, his voice cold, "you're not just a witness here. You're the prime suspect in the murder of Mary Jenkins." "No, I didn't do it," Billy shouted, his eyes wide with fear. "I swear, I don't know how those clothes got there. Someone's trying to frame me." McNabb studied him, his gaze intense. He'd heard the same thing from so many suspects before, but this time something didn't sit right. Billy wasn't acting the way a killer would. His fear was palpable, but there was no malice in his eyes. I know what it looks like, but I didn't do it, Billy continued, tears welling in his eyes. I don't know who did, but it wasn't me. McNabb leaned forward, crossing his arms. You're sure about that, Billy? Because the evidence says otherwise. You were at the scene. Your fingerprints are all over the bag, the blood-stained clothes, and that muffin. Billy's breath hitched, his voice faltering. It wasn't me. I didn't kill anyone. I found the bag and I panicked. I didn't know what to do. But McNabb wasn't listening anymore. He could see it in Billy's eyes. The fear was real, but so was the guilt that was slowly creeping up inside of him. Billy had no idea he was being set up by someone much more dangerous than him. Someone who had already killed so many and was using Billy as the next pawn in his twisted game. As McNabb walked out of the room, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was just another one of the Muffin Man's sick games. Billy might be innocent, but the Muffin Man had played his cards perfectly, and McNabb was left with one thought. He needed to catch Peter Cox before it was too late. And this time, it wasn't just McNabb who was in danger. The whole city of Los Angeles was his playground. Billy's cries echoed through the interrogation room, his voice breaking as he pleaded with McNabb. Don't you get it? Don't you see? The Muffin Man, he was here. He threw down the bag. He's real. I saw him. I swear it was him. I don't know where he went, but he was here. He did this, the Muffin Man. He's real. He was here. McNabb stood silent for a moment, watching Billy unravel. His hands were shaking, his body trembling with fear, but there was an edge to his panic that seemed genuine. The desperation in his eyes wasn't the look of someone trying to save their own skin, but someone who had seen something terrifying, something beyond belief. I saw him, McNabb, Billy continued, voice shaking as he gasped for air. I swear it was him, the Muffin Man. He's real. He's not a joke. He's out there and he's killing people. He was right here. McNabb's gaze hardened. He knew Billy's story was far-fetched, but there was something in the boy's eyes that made him hesitate. The Muffin Man, Peter Cox, had a way of staying in the shadows, manipulating people and circumstances. It wouldn't be the first time he planted fear in someone to further his twisted game. Still, McNabb wasn't ready to dismiss Billy entirely. He could feel the weight of the moment hanging heavy in the air. If Billy was telling the truth, if he really had seen the Muffin Man, then McNabb was dealing with a whole new level of unpredictability. But for now, Billy's words only deepened the mystery. Calm down, McNabb finally said, his voice cold but with a hint of concern beneath the stern exterior. I know what you're going through, but you're not making any sense. We'll figure this out. Just stop and think. What exactly did you see? What did he look like? Billy's breathing was ragged and his words tumbled out in a rush. I don't know. It was him, the Muffin Man. He's real. He's not a ghost. He was here. He was the one who did it. He's out there, McNabb. You've got to stop him. You have to stop the Muffin Man. He's coming for all of us. McNabb stood still, his jaw clenched. Something about Billy's frantic outburst made the detective wonder if he was truly just a pawn, a victim in the Muffin Man's sick game. But it also reminded him that the Muffin Man was out there, toying with everyone, even from a distance. And McNabb, he was getting closer. He could feel it. The city of Los Angeles was a place of whispers and shadows, but after the series of brutal murders that had rocked the streets, it felt more like a hunting ground. The media had latched onto the story of the Muffin Man, and now the people of the city were gripped by fear. But amidst the chaos, one man was relentless, Detective Johnny McNabb. McNabb had been on this case for years, chasing a ghost that always seemed to be one step ahead. The Muffin Man, Peter Cox, was no ordinary killer. He wasn't driven by rage or revenge. He killed for the thrill of it. A twisted game where the prize was fear itself. The investigation had led McNabb down dark alleys and into the lives of the innocent. With every victim, the Muffin Man left his signature, a blueberry muffin, carefully placed as a calling card. It was both a message and a taunt. He was always watching, always playing. But the latest victim, Billy, had offered something new. His frantic ramblings had shaken McNabb to his core, Could Billy really have seen him? Was it possible that the Muffin Man had made himself known, revealing a face that McNabb had only imagined in his worst nightmares? McNabb sat at his desk, staring at the file in front of him. The case was becoming more than just a job. It was personal. The Muffin Man had taken everything from him, his partner, his peace of mind, and soon, it seemed, his sanity. But McNabb had made a promise. He would find Peter Cox. He would stop him, no matter what it took. His phone rang, snapping him out of his thoughts. He didn't have to look to know who it was. He answered anyway. McNabb, the voice on the other end, hissed. The Muffin Man. "I'm watching, Johnny," the voice purred. "And I know you're getting closer, but you're too late. You'll always be too late." McNabb's grip tightened around the phone. He wasn't afraid, not anymore. "I'm coming for you, Peter," McNabb growled. "And when I do, you won't be able to run. I'm ending this." There was a silence on the other end, but McNabb could hear the muffled sound of what could have been laughter. It sent a chill down his spine. "Good luck, Johnny, you'll need it," the Muffin Man's voice said, and then the line went dead. McNabb set the phone down and stood up, his jaw clenched in determination. The hunt was on. As he left the office, the lights of Los Angeles flickered outside. The Muffin Man was still out there, but McNabb was no longer just a detective. He was a man on a mission. And the endgame was coming. Part 1 was over. The final chapter was waiting to be written, and McNabb would make sure it was the last.